He is undoubtedly one of the most fearless opponents of global injustice today. He has taken a principled position against injustices in Palestine, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in various parts of the world. He is one of the leading spokespersons of the anti-war movement in Britain. Over the last few years in particular, in the midst of the crisis that confronts all of us, the crisis brought about by global hegemony exercised by a few over the vast majority of humankind. In the midst of this global crisis, Mr. Galloway has emerged as a champion of global justice within the belly of the beast, which speaks a great deal about the man, his integrity, and his courage. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. George Galloway.
Some of it. My thesis is somewhat different, and I shall seek to develop it in the course of this talk today. And I'd also like to, as a matter of housekeeping, ascertain how many of you heard me speak the other day at the Global Peace Forum. Would you indicate by raising your hands if you heard my speech there? Okay, a reasonable number, but not a majority by any means. That means those who did raise their hands are going to have to listen to some of the same jokes, have to hear some of the same epigrams all over again, but I hope you'll think they were worth listening to. Right. Given that I make a speech every night, you can pity my poor staff who travel around the country with me, who have to listen to it every night and faithfully laugh at the same point every contribution. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. I have now, today, at the end of this speech, will have spoken at 1,896 public meetings since 9/11, 2001, which is definitely a world record. It has been necessary because, as Dr. Chandra rightly put it in his introduction, this has been a moment of crisis which has enveloped all of us. Some of it was foreseeable. Other parts of it have been unpredictable, but nonetheless we were called upon, required to stand up and be counted. And we in the anti-war movement in Britain have stood up, and we have been counted in our millions, in unprecedented numbers. One of my colleagues at the conference, and I see he was on Malaysian TV the other day, which is more than I've managed to get, Tariq Ali, when I went on my very first protest march, I was aged 14, it was 1968, it was a march against the American invasion and occupation of Vietnam. It ended in quite a brouhaha in Grosvenor Square. It was led by Tariq Ali, then a young student leader from Oxford University. And we thought it was a demonstration iconic forever. 100,000 people attended that demonstration. It was the most famous demonstration in Britain. 20 times that number marched in London on the 15th of February 2003 against the invasion and occupation of Iraq. 20 times larger. And so you can see that the movement which welled up in Britain, and about which I'll have more to say perhaps in the Q&A, and was reflected throughout the Western world in particular, which is another subject to which I shall return, the extent to which it welled up in the Western world but was not matched or echoed in the East and in the Muslim world by and large, was, I think, a movement which has the capacity to alter events, which is the third point that I wish to make, which is this: that powerful though our enemies are, they are not God. They are not greater than God. And justice, which is God's cause, is capable of defeating them. In other words, the very last thing I want to do is inculcate in any audience the belief that our enemies are all powerful. You know, the French revolutionary Danton had a slogan: the great only appear to be great as long as the rest of us are on our knees. When we get off our knees, the great don't appear to be superhuman at all. And it's my case, it's my thesis, using the old Chinese saying that sometimes the enemy struggles mightily to lift a huge stone only to drop it on its own feet. It's my thesis that the imperial powers responsible for the world as it looks today have now lifted a huge stone but have dropped it on their own feet. And I want to explore how we may exploit their shock and confusion as they discover this stone, which they struggled so hard to lift, has now crushed their own bones. Now, I used the title, The New World Order. I might have put a question mark after it, because in truth my case is that it's not a new world order at all. The Irish singer-songwriter Elvis Costello, I don't know if he's known around these parts, he said at the time that George Bush Sr. coined this phrase, or recoined it, because Hitler was the last man to use it before George Bush Sr. In 1991, Elvis Costello said, "I don't know about New World Order, it's more a New World Order, and it smells exactly like the old one." And this is, I believe, the truth. I used the other day the metaphor adduced by the Christian philosopher St. Augustine, writing in his book City of God, in which he tells of the encounter on the high seas between Alexander the Great and a pirate captain. Ordering the pirate to halt, Alexander demands, "How dare you terrorize these waters as a thief?" And the pirate, who must have been a spirited chap, replies, "How dare you terrorize the whole world? You, with your great navy, can call yourself an emperor and can call other men as you please." Isn't that the world that we're living in exactly today? That these self-appointed emperors, authorized by nobody, declare themselves to be the international community and decide who is a dictator who must be deposed, who is a dictator who must be propped up, who is a rogue state, who may have. That's the nicest thing you've ever done for me. Recognizing that I've only just woken up, I have my morning coffee. Recognizing who is a rogue state, who may have such and such a weapon, but who may not, who may be invaded and occupied and regime change, these self-appointed emperors, on the basis of nothing more honorable than might and the ability to do so, rule the world exactly as Alexander ruled it, by sheer power but without Alexander's wisdom. Believe me, George W. Bush is no Alexander the Great. And isn't that the world that we're living in? And isn't it exactly the world that St. Augustine was talking about? You see, as Shakespeare put it, there's nothing new under the sun. And this new world order isn't new at all. I'm from an Irish and Scottish background, so I know a thing or two about British Empire. As do you, come to think of it, as I look out amongst you. When I was a child at school, I came home, I told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said the British had an empire so vast that on it the sun never set. And my grandfather answered, that's because God would never trust the English in the dark. And what was empire then? Was empire then any different from empire under Alexander? Or empire under George W. Bush? Of course not. As George Orwell put it in his first novel, underrated novel in my view, Burmese Days, written from the standpoint of his own experience as an imperial official in Burma, through the hero Jim Flory, who tells a young woman, you know, when you boil it all down, imperialism is about going to other people's countries and stealing their things. And that's all the empire is. Of course they dress it up in all sorts of wonderful finery. As Archbishop Tutu once said to me, they came with their Bible in one hand and their gun in the other. They taught us to pray with our eyes closed. And when we opened them, they'd stolen the entire country all around us. Sometimes it's dressed up in religious clothes. Sometimes it's dressed up in the clothes of racial superiority. That we're not here to steal and loot. We're here to hold the hands of the poor natives and lead them to the sunny uplands of democracy when they're ready. And we'll hold them with one hand and scoop up as much as we can carry in the interim with the other. That's what empire is for. I represent a constituency now in the Parliament in Britain, 40% of whom come from what is now Bangladesh, but was in the past Bengal. When the English arrived in Bengal, it was the richest place in the world. When the British left Bengal, it was the poorest place in the world. And you don't have to be Einstein to work out what happened in between. Empires steal everything that they can carry in the case. I was thinking about this last night. Some people tire of the burden of our former colonies in the Caribbean. How we endlessly fight for trade preferences for their bananas and so on. And how much of our aid budget is being spent on small islands in the Caribbean. One of the reasons why is that in the Caribbean live the people
whom our empire actually carried off as slaves in chains in the hold of ships. We didn't just steal everything we could cut down or excavate. We stole the very people themselves and took them as slaves to the Caribbean to work as slaves, and their great-grandchildren are there now asking us for a bit of preference for their bananas, and some of our powerful and wealthy people complain about it. So it's my thesis that imperialism, for that is what we are talking about, flows from the system of exploitation, one of the other, that we call globalized capitalism. Not that it's a secret conspiracy or a secret society, but that it flows ineluctably from the economic system of exploitation, one of the other. And the rich in the rich countries exploit the poor of the rich countries. The rich countries exploit the poor countries, and they create a comprador of collaborators in the poor countries to do their bidding, which is another important part of my case, which is that this new world order would not be possible without the collaboration of local quislings whose purpose is to assist the imperial power to exploit their own country in exchange for a few favors or a seat. I thought it very funny when Dr. Mahathir, in his review of the conference, talked about how good the British were at doublespeak. And it's absolutely true. It was seen most graphically in the run-up to the Iraq War, when you had perfectly exemplified in the figure of two human beings the difference between British imperialism and American imperialism. In the two figures representing the two countries at the United Nations. In the case of Britain, you had Sir Jeremy Greenstock, Oxford educated, public school educated. Public school in our country, of course, means anything other than public. It means the opposite of public. Effete, elegant, highly educated, articulate, lying and twisting to try and get the world to agree to a war on Iraq, which he now tells us in his memoirs, which are banned by Mr. Blair, he opposed. What kind of a man can make such a performance in support of something he now tells us he thought was a bad idea? But he did it with brilliance. And the American ambassador, John Negroponte, looking like he just strolled off the movie set of The Godfather, looking like a mafia don, dripping with contempt for the United Nations, his whole demeanor screaming, I don't want to be here. I'm only even here to please this fellow, Greenstock, to be seen to be going through the motions to try and persuade the United Nations to commit this crime with us. Doesn't look like it's working, so let's get the crime started. But this British capacity for doublespeak, as Dr. Mahathir put it, appointing rulers whose main characteristic is that they do not rule, appointing British government advisors whose main characteristic is that their advice must always be accepted, is merely the artifice of empire. Britain sees itself as Greece, to America's Rome. But Greece and Rome were exploiters and imperialists just the same. One may have had a fancier way of talking, but they were exploiters and imperialists just the same. Now we have in the world today, I believe only temporarily, a return to the most naked form of imperialism, which existed in the great scramble of the 19th century, the last half of the 18th, and lasted, stretched until midway through the 20th, when the imperial powers physically occupied and flew their own flags over the colonized territories of the world, colonizing the minds of the people growing up under their imperial tutelage. This is a very important point. I often find in visits to the former British Empire that I'm the only anti-imperialist in the room because of the development of this comprador, which has had its mind colonized. That's often the case. But as the colonized people began to fight back against naked colonialism, one by one these colonies were evacuated in a physical sense. The flags of the imperial countries run down. The flags of newly independent countries raised. Independence declared. Puppet presidents and corrupt kings installed so that business could go on as usual, notwithstanding the change of flag. And for a very brief period, it will be seen historically, that was the way that the system would operate. But in key parts of the world, one key part in particular, which is why I'm here, in the Muslim world, that settlement was proving increasingly fragile, vulnerable, likely to topple. Not just the Arab world, Iran and other Muslim countries must be included in this. It was increasingly possible that these puppet presidents and corrupt kings would fall, and they would fall to a new political force and power which would challenge the underlying assumptions of the system of globalization and exploitation and war, which is the ineluctable outgrowth of that system. I refer to the rise of political Islam. Political Islam being the last option left, nationalism, socialism, communism, having all been tried and failed, political Islam was beginning to generate the possibility of power and real change. And thus the imperialists would have lost everything. Having put all their eggs in the baskets of tyrants, if and when those tyrants fell, they would fall like the Shah of Persia with enormous reverberations. If you remember, the exchange of power in Iran with the Islamic Revolution was not a normal change. It was not a coup d'etat carried out in the dead of the night and announced on the radio station to a passive population the day after. The Iranian Revolution garnered the support of tens of millions of people who were ready to give their very life itself to bring down the tyrant. The reason the Iranian army stopped firing was because they didn't have enough bullets to kill everyone who was coming towards them. And they knew that when their magazine was empty, those they had not managed to kill would tear them limb from limb. And before this enormous popular power, the biggest tyrant in the entire region fell, despite the support and the arms and all the paraphernalia of repression given to him by the Western patrons of his dictatorship. Believe me, the imperialists gazed upon the Iranian Revolution and trembled. This fate of this tyrant might be repeated in country after country, especially strategically important countries in that region and beyond. So they have decided that the comprador can no longer be depended upon and have reoccupied 5 Arabian Gulf countries containing within them 550 years of oil and gas. Again, you don't have to be Einstein to work out why the United States would like to occupy 5 countries with 550 years of oil and gas. America has only 25 years of oil and gas. Britain only 15. But their occupation of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, now Iraq, has secured for them this enormous stranglehold for the time being. But Allahu Akbar, God works in mysterious ways. The poor, broken, ragged Iraqi people who were supposed to welcome these foreign invaders, supposed to throw flowers at them, supposed to sit passively while their country was carved up like a giant shawarma and handed out the most succulent pieces to the most beneficent contributors to the campaign funds of George Bush and Dick Cheney, had instead, in their sandals, in their ragged clothes, young men whose names we don't know, whose faces we've never seen, in organizations which are never announced, have risen up in every part of Iraq and are confronting this mighty behemoth to the extent that they have brought it to a standstill, so that the entire political discourse in the United States now is how and when they can get out of this mess that they have gotten themselves into. A country that's spending more on military expenditure than all the other countries of the world combined is having to frantically search for an exit from a poor country whose people they had spent more than a decade massacring by sanctions, who were literally hungry and malnourished, and were fighting with the smallest of arms against the mightiest that defense procurement can secure, have beaten them. Believe me, these Iraqis, these unknown Iraqis, who are writing their name in the stars, are defending not only Iraq, but defending all the Arabs and all the Muslims. Because if they had lain down and been crushed by this behemoth, the United States would be in Damascus already. They would be in Tehran already. The fact that they cannot dream of invading any other Muslim country is because of this Iraqi resistance. Which goes to show, which is my point, that the mighty are not so mighty, that if we get off our knees and fight them, we can defeat them. And that's exactly what's happening now around the world. In Bolivia, yesterday, an Indian, an indigenous Indian, wearing sand shoes, representing the poorest masses of Bolivia, won a landslide election victory, despite the overt and active opposition of the United States government, which moved heaven and earth to defeat him. He won a landslide victory, despite describing himself, unwisely I think, as America's worst nightmare. He won a landslide victory in Bolivia. People Morales, the new president. This follows the triumph of the great Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who has twice defeated United States subversion, which twice has overthrown him, and twice he's been reinstated by the poor masses of Caracas, who have placed him back in the president's house. The president of Brazil, of Argentina, of Chile, of Ecuador, of Uruguay for the first time ever, one after the other of these Latin American countries, are either electing or placing radical governments at their helm, whose avowed intention is to challenge American domination of their part of the continent and American exploitation of their wealth. This is a remarkable transformation. Fidel Castro feels young again. His life is beginning all over again. And this spirit of defiance to the United States hegemony is what is breaking out all over the world. And it links all of us. We are, in our own way in England, saying we don't mind having a special relationship with the United States. We recognize we are two countries divided by a common language. We recognize that we have a special relationship. We just don't want the kind of special relationship that Mitch Lewinsky had with the former president of the United States. And by the way, there's nothing anti-American about me. I'm the great grandson of the only woman in the entire 19th century who emigrated from America to Scotland. I think she got on the wrong boat, but that's what happened. We in Europe are declaring we like many things about America, but we don't want to be Americans. Isn't that happening everywhere? This rising tide of rejection of American capitalist globalization and domination is the big idea of the 21st century. From China to England to many other parts of the world, this phenomenon taking many forms, even if it's just its most basic of avoiding McDonald's, Marlboro, Esso, Coca-Cola, avoiding those emblematic, iconic images of American globalization, or whether it's the form of actually fighting American domination and occupation in Iraq. This wave is the wave of the 21st century, and you know what? Many people in the United States are our allies in this. Just like I don't want my country to be an empire again, so millions in the United States do not want their country to be an empire trampling around the world, crushing people under interests underfoot. And we have to make common cause with them also. Not just because empire is immoral. It's immoral to steal other people's things. But because, as they found out in the United States on 9/11 and in Britain on 7/7, the empire strikes back. The empire strikes back. People will oppose a return to empire. And they may do so in horrific ways. But if occupation is ugly, how can resistance be pretty? They may do so in ways which actually do no good, strengthen the empire rather than weaken it, which is what I argue happened on 9/11 and on 7/7. But strike back they will, here and there, in the occupied land and in the metropolis. And I don't want my children and their children to grow up in a world where my country and people who look like me are hated around the world and millions trying to hurt us. So, we do really need a new world order. And there are things that we could do. One of them was first formulated here by Mahathir. We have to end this dependence on the US dollar. Why are we holding US dollars? Why are we funding America's war machine by holding our reserves in US dollars? The euro is a very nice currency, you know. It's very nice. It looks nice. It has a good value. Why are all the oil producers, including countries that are openly threatened by the United States, pricing their exports in dollars? Why should Iran price its oil in dollars? One of the things which Saddam Hussein did, which brought this invasion down upon him, was he unilaterally opted out of dollars in the pricing of oil and moved into euros, which was very acceptable to the Europeans, but a big threat to the United States. If all the oil producers, if Chavez and Iran and Malaysia and other producers were to get together and say, henceforth our oil is priced in something else, you would be decisively dealing a blow at American imperial power. Let me touch, sensitive as it is, on Saudi Arabia, which has $1 trillion in American banks and another $1 trillion in the American Stock Exchange. Not to mention the billions spent on British and American weapons they can't use, and the hundreds of millions wasted in the bordellos and the casinos and the property markets of the West. How could the Muslim world have been transformed with this wealth if it had been sent not to the sinks of Western capitalism, but invested in the Ummah and its economic and social development? Like a rainstorm on a desert, it would have transformed the landscape, but it has not. Probably now cannot. If the Saudis decided to take the money back, the United States would say, what money? We didn't hear about that. Or they'd say it was terrorist funds and confiscate it. In other words, all this wealth which God gave to a Muslim country has been handed to the shaitan who is massacring Muslims all over the world. Donald Rumsfeld was very open about it. He wasn't joking. Donald Rumsfeld said, it's not our fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries. That's what he said, and he meant it. Why do we participate in this farce called the United Nations? Why do we pretend there's anything called the United Nations? It's a thieves and beggars' kitchen. The thieves make the decisions, and the beggars vote for the decisions in exchange for some of the crumbs off the table. And if the beggars will not vote, the thieves merely walk outside and do what they intended to do anyway. And yet we call it a United Nations. The World Bank, presided over by Paul Wolfowitz. It's like placing Count Dracula in charge of the blood transfusion center. Paul Wolfowitz, a mass killer, a zealot for the very economic system which provides the reason for the economic division of the world into one in which a small part of the world swims in champagne while half the world doesn't have clean water to drink. Dr. Mahathir's presentation the other day about the losses in war. In the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in the First World War, 80,000 British men fell. It was the worst day in the history of British arms. Every 2 days, more people die of poverty in the world than died at the Somme. We saw the pictures of the devastation of the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every 2 weeks, more people die of poverty in the world than died in the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We saw a review of the wars of the 20th century in the presentation. Every 2 years, more people die of poverty in the world than died in all the wars of the 20th century combined. I tell you, capitalism killed more people than Hitler and Stalin and Mao and all the dictators of the world put together. And Paul Wolfowitz is the spokesman for that system. So they put him in charge of the World Bank. I'm probably trying your patience now, Chandra. I should begin to wind up. It's my case that this system of globalization and war is the enemy of the vast majority of people in the world. And what we must do is find unity in opposing it, and by opposing, end it. We can do it. The brains that are in this room, the brains that were on the podium of Dr. Mahathir's conference, I looked at them and I thought, you know, if we declared ourselves the world government, we'd do a lot better than the people running the world at the moment. I mean, we are many, they are few. The project is so obvious when you open your eyes. They support the system they do because it benefits them. It follows that those of us whom it doesn't benefit have no interest in its continuation. All we have to do is open our eyes, think clearly, stand up, and we can change the world. Wassalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
grabbing other people's resources, using power to perpetuate one's privilege. This is what it is. Even though many of our societies which were victims of imperialism have become independent, we have had the misfortune of being led in most instances by puppets. And these puppets have not brought about the transformation the people want. Which is why resistance has grown in some parts of the colonized world, or the world that was once colonized, or dominated by hegemonic forces. And he gave the examples of resistance in Iran, in Iraq, and in Latin America. What he was implying, I think, and this is a very important point, that this resistance cuts across religious, ethnic, cultural, national boundaries. And this is a point that we must always keep in mind. Today, for instance, if one may reinforce the point which Mr. Galloway has made so eloquently, we see organized resistance to American imperialism from Latin America, which is almost completely non-Muslim. You have resistance from parts of the Muslim world, in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan, and in other places, but certainly Palestine, which is another outstanding example of resistance to both regional hegemony and global hegemony. Regional hegemony represented by Israel, and global hegemony by Washington and London, and so on and so forth. In other words, what we have to understand about resistance is that this resistance, which is so important in bringing about justice, is a resistance rooted in our common humanity. This, I think, is a very important message that we have to keep in mind. And Mr. Galloway also argued that it's not just people in those parts of the world which have been dominated by these global forces who are resisting hegemony. Resistance is also taking place in Britain, in the United States of America. They don't want their nations to become empires, because they know what empire does to people. In the case of the United States of America, for instance, there are lots of American intellectuals who say, look, the United States must be a republic, not an empire, because it's a republic which is embodied in the American Declaration of Independence, in the American Constitution. This notion of a republic, not an empire. So there is a lot of antagonism about empire even within the United States of America and Britain, which also shows us that this struggle is actually not a struggle against particular nations in the ultimate analysis. It's a struggle against structures of power. And human beings, wherever they are, will have to get together to oppose these structures of power. And then Mr. Galloway went on to talk about some of the things that we could do. He made a very important proposal here about fighting dependence upon the dollar. In fact, this term has been used by quite a lot of analysts, dollar hegemony. And this is something which has taken place partly because there are nations which allow this sort of hegemony to take place. The way in which Saudi Arabia and a number of other countries have invested in the dollar. And he gave statistics to support this. How trillions of dollars, which is their wealth, helps to keep this bankrupt Washington-led financial system alive. The Washington Consensus would not exist without the support of the Arab countries and other countries which have been exploited by the dollar. Mr. Galloway talked about Muslim leaders so subservient, supine, servile as far as power structure is concerned. And this is part of the problem. And they have kept their own people in poverty. And he ended by telling us that it is our duty to stand up to end the system. It's a question of human beings becoming conscious of their own dignity, of becoming aware that there is such a thing as self-respect, which is why I think his party the party that he founded is called Respect in England. This is a new party. It's a pity that we are not voters, otherwise it would have a party which has one member of parliament at the moment, and that's George Galloway himself, but we hope he'll do well in the coming elections in Britain, and local government elections and future elections. So respect is fundamental. It is regaining one's self-respect. That is one. And we have to become conscious of this, aware of it, and spread this awareness. This, in a nutshell, is the essence of Galloway's message. A very powerful message, a very important message. And what we'd like to do now is to interact with you. If you have questions to ask, make them brief so that others can ask questions. If you have comments to make them succinct so that others can also make their comments. Could I suggest that those who want to ask questions, make comments, you don't mind, please line up behind the microphones, because that makes it much easier for me as the moderator. There are two microphones.
It was a very good speech, the Honorable, I would call you brother, Galloway. It reminded me of my childhood, listening to Muhammad Mossadegh of Iran. It reminded me of Jamal Abdel Nasser, kept us awake for hours and hours behind the radio. It reminded me of Ahmed Subarni of Indonesia and our own Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. I would like first, with your permission, sir, to make a small correction to your economic dollar view. It's just a correction. I know you are a street politician. You learn everything from the street. Iran, although prices oil in dollars, doesn't have $1 in reserve anywhere in the world. All of its reserves are in euros and other Asian currencies. Secondly, I would like to ask you a question. Palestine was a horror of imperialism of the British, handed over by the famous Masonic Jewish Rothschild banker on the famous Balfour Declaration, the greatest shame on a British civilization, was created by Britain, later on supported by the United States of America. When we will see people like you in Britain to reverse this trend and give back Palestine to people of Palestine.
For the partial correction, and I shall amend my discourse accordingly. But I have to disagree with a fundamental point which you made, and which I think underlies what I think you believe. Palestine was not handed over by the Jewish Masonic banker Rothschild. Palestine was handed over by Balfour. Balfour was one of the most notorious anti-Semites in Britain. Balfour hated Jews. Not only was he not a Jew, he hated Jews. And it is vital to understand that you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. In fact, the biggest Zionists are not Jews. Anybody who thinks George Bush likes Jews has never visited his country club or checked how many of his friends have married Jews. These people don't support Zionism because they love Jews or Jewishness, but because Zionism serves their imperial interests. They invented it in order to serve their imperial interests. And this is central, because otherwise you develop a conspiratorial view of the world. You imagine that in America the tail is wagging the dog.
And that therefore, if we could only cut off this tail, the dog would start to do the right thing. But America does what it does in the Middle East because it's its policy. Not because any Jew or Mason is telling it to do it. Not because it wants to keep the Arab world divided and weak. And that's exactly what they have succeeded in doing, and Israel is a major arm of that policy. I have been for 31 years in the front line of fighting for Palestine. And I know that Britain has a historic responsibility towards the reversal of one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. We ought to feel at least as culpable as we face the Palestinian people, as the German government, for example, feels towards Israel. At least as culpable. We are responsible for this big disaster, which is the cancer at the heart of relations between East and West. But it's vital to view this question clearly. Otherwise we go off down alleys which are blind alleys. America doesn't work for Israel. Israel works for America. It's a crucial paradigm to grasp. Israel works for America. And lastly, I say to my friend, I hope he's still my friend, the vision that you painted with Nasser keeping you awake till the early hours reminded me of something I often say. If only Nasser had had Al Jazeera at his disposal. Instead of just radio, with people like you, young men listening, young boys listening under the covers. If President Nasser, with this message of Arab unity, had had an Al Jazeera at his disposal, reaching people through their television sets in every part of the world, it would have made a huge difference. Maybe we would have a very different world now today. So why doesn't Mahathir get a TV station? It's very cheap now. Any Tom, Dick or Harry can set up a satellite television station. It's very, very cheap. We could have TV al-Mahathir. I'll come and work for it. It might be a very important development from this Fardana peace process, peace forum road. Otherwise, if we just have a conference which lets off some hot air, it won't have done much good in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you.
The people, the public in America and in Europe, still indifferent. Before the invasion of Iraq, there was a joke. Please allow me to tell you the joke. Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld tried to convince George Bush to invade Iraq. They took him to a pub because he's alcoholic. Yes. After a few drinks, Dick Cheney told the public in the pub, in the bar, say, the president is going to invade Iraq, but I must warn you, there will be 1 million Iraqi dead and 1 belly dancer. All of a sudden, the public say, why the belly dancer? Then Dick Cheney said, you see, Mr. President, they don't care about the million Iraqi ships. They care only about the belly dancer.
Because you are my friend, I'm going to answer you just as sharply as I did the last one. Why do you put it this way? It's not the Western public who are indifferent. It's the Muslim public who is indifferent. It's the Muslim public who are ruled by the puppets. We're collaborating with the... We were in our millions on the streets of England and the United States. Where were the Muslim millions? Where were the millions in Cairo? Where were the millions in Kuala Lumpur? Where were the millions around the Muslim world? Yes, you see, someone said that I won't identify them for obvious reasons. We were suppressed. Wallahi. Who's suppressing you? These are dwarves who are suppressing you. If the Iranian people can overthrow the Shah of Persia, why do you allow yourself to be suppressed by dwarves? And then criticize us Are we not? Do I not have scars for the sacrifice I made for Iraq?
Yes.
Believe me, I'm bleeding for this. But I'm ready to bleed. I'm ready to bleed for this. And we all have to be ready. If we do not stand up against our tyrants, then we don't have the right to criticize others. My friend, for 30 years is right. Every day we're waking up to a new scandal in the name of Bush and Blair, and believe me, both of them are losing political strength faster than water running out of the hole in the bottom of a bucket. Bush will be lucky to finish his term as president. He might end in the jailhouse, never mind the White House. The speed with which things are deteriorating for him. Blair is in a completely emaciated political position. He couldn't dream of announcing another Bush war. He's now under threat from a new conservative leader, from us on the left. He's in a very perilous political position. It's true we didn't defeat him in the general election, but we cost him half of his majority. He went into the election with a majority of 150, and we cut it in half, so that it's now possible to defeat him, as we did in the House of Commons recently, on the issue of incarcerating people without charge. We inflicted a significant defeat on him because we halved his majority at the general election. He lost 1 million votes between 2001 and 2005. We were that million. We were responsible for that loss. So we are doing everything that we can. I'm giving all my breath for this cause. But as I implied from the rostrum, there's no echo from the Muslim world. Believe me, I'm listening for it. And moreover, the lack of an echo is used by Blair against me. When I tell him, you are enraging the Muslim masses who might rise up and topple all your friends, he laughs. He said, where are these masses? I'm watching the TV from morning till night, and I don't see these masses. And it's not good enough to say. I'm not talking about Malaysia, which is a very different country and a very different leadership. But it's not good enough to say, as they say to me in all Muslim countries, well, what can we do? We are repressed. Fight the repression. Throw this repression off your neck, or don't call yourself a Muslim. Because a Muslim talk to oppose injustice, speak out against tyranny, not to sit quietly watching others sacrificing and saying you can't do anything because you are repressed. When the Hezbollah drove the Israeli occupation from Lebanon, they were acting as Muslims. When the young boys in the Intifada in Palestine daily confront Sharon's superpower, they are acting as Muslims. When the Muqawama in Iraq fights with their teeth the American occupation of their country, they are acting as Muslims. And everybody else acted as Muslims too.
He said that in order to control the slaves, which were called niggers in that time, Uncle Tom employed Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom is also a slave at the employment of Uncle Tom. Now Uncle Tom was even harder on the slaves than Uncle Tom was, because Uncle Tom was a house nigger, whereas there were two types of slaves: the field slaves and the house slaves, which were called the house niggers. If the house caught on fire, the house nigger would say,
oh, we are at fire, we must say, what's the matter, boss? He refers to his master as the boss. He would fight to put out the blaze more than the master would. And if the field nigger comes to the house nigger and says, hey man, let's separate, let's run away. He says, man, you're crazy. Where do I find better food than this? Because he ate leftovers of the master. Where do I find better clothes than this? Because he wore the old rags of the master. Where do I find better house to live in? Because he always lived either in the attic or in the basement. Now, in reference to that, what Rahimahullah, Abdul Malik Khabbaz or Malcolm X was referring to, is that he said, we have so many house figures running around us, and unless we get rid of these house figures, we can never be free. And so, if you look at our present situation, in Palestine where there is no government, the Palestinians are really doing their job. In Lebanon, during the time of the civil war when there was no government, the Lebanese did a marvelous job when they got rid of the Israelis. In Iraq, when there is no government, you see the Iraqis are doing wonders. So when do the rest of the Muslim world do wonders?
I just get nervous when anyone tells me I remind them of Malcolm X because of the ending of Malcolm X. Shot on a public platform like this. Thank you, brother.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Galloway, thank you sincerely for a very provocative talk and entertaining, and it makes my position extremely difficult in asking you certain questions. But let me present to you two questions which I think are safe. And if time permits, I'll come up with the other one, which is very uncomfortable for me to reach. First, 9/11. Are you one of those who also subscribe to the belief that 9/11 was carefully planned years before 9/11 and it was inspired by the Mossad? No. Second, the Holocaust. Do you also believe, as some people do, that it's a brilliant deception and a fake?
No. The answer to both those questions is no, and both of them are dangerous questions, and they assist the enemy. I'm sorry to tell you this. First of all, I'll deal with the second. Fascism, in the Hitler form, caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. Its whole essence was racist. And it wasn't just racist against Jews. I'm always amazed when Muslims imagine somehow that in Hitler's worldview they were not subhumans. He just didn't get around to the Muslims. Everyone was an Untermensch, a subhuman to the Hitlerites, except the blonde, blue-eyed European Aryans, of which Hitler himself was not one. Hitler massacred systematically, genocidally, millions of Jews, gypsies, disabled people. In fact, the first people he massacred were disabled people. If Dr. Chandra will forgive me to say this, as a man in a wheelchair, Hitler would have massacred him on every count. His color, his religion, his disability. We mustn't make light of this by describing it as brilliant propaganda. It happened. Millions of people were massacred by Hitler. And we only help our enemies by appearing to doubt it. By appearing to say, well, it couldn't have been 6 million. Who cares if it was 6 million or 5 million? Or 4 million or 3 million? It was a massacre of people on a racist basis.
And we should acknowledge that. And then say, now that you know the monster of racism, you, the Jewish people, how come you're so silent about the racist massacre of the Palestinians? That's how we should handle this question. And I don't believe at all that the attack on the Twin Towers was planned years before and that it was done by the Mossad. This is absurd. Bin Laden declared that he was behind the attack on 9/11. Why don't we accept what he said? In fact, it's doing the enemy's bidding by raising this possibility. Better to say, as I said, in New York, in September. It's easy to do that in New York and in September. I said, you may have thought that these airplanes which struck the Twin Towers on 9/11/2001 emerged out of a clear blue sky. But in fact they emerged out of a swamp of hatred and bitterness which you have drenched with blood around the world by your double standards and your injustice. Isn't that the truth? And it's a much more powerful truth than saying the Americans did it to themselves. If they did it to themselves, well, all they have to do is get rid of Bush and the problem will be solved. But if it didn't do it to themselves, but it emerged out of this swamp, our demand is you must drain this swamp by reversing the policies which drenched this swamp in the first place. By freeing Palestine, by sending your armies to knock down Sharon's wall and free the Palestinian people, by withdrawing from Iraq, by stopping propping up the corrupt kings and puppet presidents of the Muslim world. That's what you have to do to drain the swamp. Is that a more powerful manifesto than going off down a conspiracy theory blind alley?
Thank you, Mr. Galloway, for your thoughtful presentation. Nice to meet people like you. They have enough brains to say the truth, and they are fearless in their speech. So just some notes. I have it. Relation to the Iranian revolution, and they stopped and they changed, and that time the regime and so on. But what we get later, is Iran now supporting the Muslims? Actually we get confused when we hear the top leader of Iran say, because of Iran, America can occupy two Muslim countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not needed. This is the top leader of Iraq. And if you go down now to Iraq and you see the situation, who is the supporter of America? The Iranian followers and Iranian intelligence are supporting the Americans and who are participating in the government and participate in a lot of militias who kill the Iraqi and try to kill their resistance. So this is, I think, conflict we have to solve in our Islamic world. We have to go back and re-activate our ethical and moral values, and especially the Islamic values. Then we can get rid of this situation that we have. Unless we are hypocritic people and we say something but we do other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this is a more complicated question than that. We have to go back. You see, Saddam Hussein made many mistakes, many very big mistakes. In my opinion, the biggest mistake was not to attack Kuwait, but to attack Iran. He attacked Iran to please America and Britain and their Gulf potentates
whose rule was threatened by the Islamic Revolution of Khomeini. Now, I'm not a Shiite, I'm not a spokesman for the Khomeiniites, and I disagree with much of the policy of the government of Iran today, but there's a history to this. And the history is that Saddam Hussein invaded Iran to destroy their Islamic Revolution. And he was paid by the Gulf and armed by the West to do so. This has poisoned the well of relations between Iran and Iraq. And there's no point in pretending otherwise. Secondly, Iran doesn't have just one voice. I know the quotation to which you refer. Now, I'm not sure it came from the top man. But Iran is also supporting Hezbollah. Hezbollah's leader, Sheikh Nasrallah, is every Friday on the Al-Manar TV station supporting the Palestinian Revolution, denouncing America, denouncing Zionism, denouncing imperialism in the most popular way of any Muslim ruler anywhere that I know. People who are not Shiites are listening to Al-Manar to hear Nasrallah's speeches. It's true that Iran is supporting the collaborator, traitors, Hakim and others in the occupation of Iraq. But other parts of Iran are also supporting other things. Muqtada Sadr's movement also has support from some parts of Iran. Now, the best way to approach this is to draw Iran as a state back into our coalition against American imperialism. Therefore, we should weigh our words towards them carefully, because they have an objective interest in being with us, because they are next. If the Iraqi resistance is defeated, Iran is the next on the agenda, along with Syria. And they will never accept Iran being strong, no matter how much the Iranian government collaborates with them. They will not accept any Muslim country being strong, having nuclear power, maybe having a nuclear weapon. They will not accept it. So, Ahmadinejad and the others had better wise up to the fact that objectively their interests lie with those trying to defeat American domination and occupation of the region, and their foreign policy should reflect it. I have refused to go to Iran. They asked me to go there now, on the 1st of January. I refuse regularly to go to Iran, precisely because I'm, like you, not satisfied with their stand. I refuse to meet Nasrallah because I'm not satisfied by how clear he is on the Iraqi resistance as opposed to the Palestinian resistance. But I'm ready to welcome both of them into our coalition, and we should invite them to do so.
Thank you. Chalo?
Yeah, okay, I'm not an Iraqi. And I'm also not a UIA student. I'm also not a Muslim. I'm from the Socialist Party. My name is Aru. The party where our registration was denied till today, since the time of Dr. Mahathir. But that's not my issue here. My issue here is on the issue of rights to have nuclear weapons. What about, in this uneven world order, where do you stand when countries need nuclear weapons to defend themselves? The issue of Korea, Iran and all that. I feel that we are in a situation where you can't have people at least have weapons which can defend you. So where do you go on that, on the issue of nuclear weapons?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to put my question. My name is Abdul Malik. I'm from Namibia. I'm an IU student here. Well, for me, I've been doing a bit of reading, trying to understand the world and of course what is going on. Now, when you responded to this question on the issue of conspiracy and stuff like that, especially on the issue of September 11, almost in a dismissive way, of course also reflects maybe your belief that there's no such a thing as conspiracy theory or something like that. What I would actually like to ask, because to me sometimes I also get confused in individuals. Sometimes you hear, for example, in this case that Bin Laden apparently acknowledged or accepted responsibility, or of course also I knew that at some point he denied responsibility. So on that one I'm not quite clear. But what I would actually want to find out specifically is whether you are dismissing the whole issue of conspiracy theory factor at all in other world events, despite, because also in America themselves they have got information which they say that even if their government isn't bomb themselves, somehow they have prior knowledge that this